Bueno, para cualquier profesor de la Escuela Andaluza de Salud Pública es un honor estar aquí ahora con todos ustedes. Para mí es un doble honor porque voy a presentar nada más y nada menos que Anthony Morgan, que es un compañero de viaje y del que he aprendido muchísimo. El profesor Anthony Morgan es un especialista en salud pública que ha trabajado en diversos departamentos en el Servicio Nacional de Salud y para el Ministerio de Salud en el Reino Unido. Ha colaborado básicamente en una primera etapa con lo que fue la Autoridad Nacional para la Educación para la Salud, cuando era todavía más joven que ahora. Después trabajó directamente en varios espacios de responsabilidad en lo que fue la Agencia para el Desarrollo Sanitario, para posteriormente, en los últimos años, terminar trabajando como director asociado en el Centro Nacional de lo que fue llamado Excelencia Clínica y ahora llamado Centro Nacional o Instituto Nacional de Salud y Excelencia de los Cuidados, o más conocido con sus siglas NICE. Ahí lo que ha hecho fundamentalmente ha sido ser el responsable de las guías de salud pública, o sea, la mayoría de las guías de salud pública del Centro de Excelencia de Salud Pública de NICE han sido coordinadas por Anthony. Él se graduó en la Escuela de Medicina Tropical de Londres y después hizo su doctorado en el Instituto Karolinska, centros de los cuales es un compañero de trabajo, un profesor asociado ahí. También es un profesor asociado aquí en la Escuela Andaluza de Salud Pública. Llevamos ya unos cuantos años colaborando conjuntamente con muchas personas de la casa. Ha trabajado y publica en diversas revistas del ramo, especialmente revistas ligadas a la salud pública, y es editor en jefe de alguna de ellas. Y es una excelente persona, así que os dejo con él.
Porque no es posible para hablar en español, porque yo puedo hablar solo en chiclanero. Y creo que sí, no es posible para entenderme. So I have a translator, and this I think will be easier for me. My job today, in the next 30 minutes, is to provide you with a perspective on my experience of evidence-based decision-making, primarily in England. And I'm going to draw on my experience of working with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. So I'll start with setting the scene for those of you who are not familiar with the health and social care system in England, talk a little bit about where the evidence-based movement came from, and then talk in depth about the work of NICE. But importantly at the end, I'm going to talk about the challenges of implementation, because NICE guidance in itself will not change practice. And then you can compare and contrast with the system that you have in Spain. You can learn from it, or you can ignore it. But this is my perspective. So this complicated diagram is what we call the health and care social system in England. And it's an opportunity to try and connect different types of organizations, including those who provide care, those who commission care, those who have a responsibility for improving public health, particularly a number of organizations who have the responsibilities to try and empower people and local communities to get involved in decision-making processes in health. Other organizations that have the responsibility for educating and training professionals, because if we don't have a skilled workforce, then NICE guidance, for example, will not be able to be implemented effectively. And importantly, increasingly importantly, the idea of a range of institutions who are responsible for safeguarding patients. Now, for those of you who do understand a little bit of English, you might want to follow this link and go to the alternative guide to the NHS, which was produced by a charity called the King's Fund. They describe the organisation as a very chaotic system that's been Health and Social Care Act, and actually has had the effect of bringing the system into chaos, displacing professionals, so they're not able to actually do the work that they've been employed to do. Anyway, I think it's an alternative version that may be helpful to you. But the system is based on a number of things: improving qualities, being specific about the outcomes, and importantly, trying to find ways of effectively involving local people in the decision-making process. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but this is the example of an outcomes framework and standards that all organisations within the NHS and health and care social care system have to work towards. We're very specific about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, whether that be about preventing people from dying prematurely or helping to ensure a positive patient experience. And all organisations have a responsibility to work towards these outcomes, and they will be monitored and regulated against them. In terms of evidence, and the word that I'm going to talk about, remember, is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, we have a range of institutions that are responsible not only for providing evidence, but actually making sure that the evidence is implemented effectively. And in this slide, I give you examples of some of the organisations that have a responsibility for and expect professionals to use guidance to inform practice as part of revalidation. Most people, most professionals, doctors, nurses, have to go through an annual revalidation process, and they will be tested or benchmarked against their ability to use and implement NICE guidance. And they use NICE guidance to inform national audits. All organisations within the health and care social system have to go through a process of audit, and this is important. So using evidence in relation to regulation is really important to ensure that effective care can take place. So moving on to the evidence-based approach, most of you who've been involved in evidence-based decision-making will know this guy, Archie Cochrane. He was one of the key founders of trying to think about how we improve the quality of professional practice. And he developed the Cochrane collaboration that I'll talk a little bit now. But I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that evidence-based medicine and evidence-based public health in particular is still relatively new. In the UK specifically, it came into being in the early 90s. That said, evidence and the use of evidence is not new, and for those epidemiologists in the room, I point to the work of John Snow, who was using evidence, perhaps not using randomized controls at that time, but trying to detect where and how the problem came from, actually was able to find the source of cholera in a very large epidemic of cholera in London in the mid-1800s. So the use of evidence has been around a long time. What we've moved towards in the 1990s is a more systematic approach to trying to collate the evidence that we have from scientific studies. Importantly, post-Second World War was the first example of a randomized control trial in relation to the use of antibiotics in the NHS. So it's been around a long time, but evidence-based medicine as we know it is still relatively new, although you might argue it's not new now because we've had 25 years of it, and that's perhaps quite a long time. I put this slide on because traditionally when people think of evidence, they think of the randomized control trials, which I think in the UK is still seen as the gold standard. But I want to make a remark here in relation to the use of evidence, particularly within the context of public health. Given the complexity of the reasons why people are able to attain health or not, we need to take account of a whole range of different things, from the drugs and procedures that we use in the health service, to the way that we actually think about the social context of people's lives. And we need to understand the social context of people's lives by listening to them. This is why stakeholder involvement is important. But try to understand the different types of evidence that we need to make in order to make the best decision. Remember, the reason why we want an evidence-based medicine movement is to try and move towards the best decision that we possibly can. The randomized control trial is a key tool within that endeavor, but there's a whole range of different evidence that we need in order to be effective. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but this slide just describes the development of the evidence-based movement and the way that we now see it. It's central to everything that we do in the NHS. Although, interestingly, in terms of public health in 2013 moved back to be the responsibility of those working in local government. Local government in the UK do not have the same tradition of evidence-based decision-making, and therefore we're having to actually benefit to make decisions based on the best available evidence. But essentially within the NHS, the evidence-based movement in the UK is strong and is very much needed in order to make sure that we increase standards and that we actually improve patient safety. Why is evidence-based movement so important? Medical interventions are inherently risky, and clinical decisions should be based on the best available evidence. And the best available evidence needs to be as least biased as possible, although even the randomized control trial could not get rid of all the biases that are out there. And therefore we need to make sure that we introduce a process for understanding that we're moving towards making the right decision. We have to protect patients from medical incompetence and the inflated claims of the pharmaceutical industry. In 1992, the National Health Service Research and Development Programme provided funding for the establishment of the Cochrane Centre in Oxford. And since then, 28,000 scientists from 100 countries have been producing systematic reviews of the evidence. But again, this is only the starting point for thinking about how we produce effective actions at a local level. Hence, we arrive at this idea called the National Institute for Care Excellence. I nearly said clinical excellence because it's changed its name over time. That'll become apparent in a little while. The reason why it was set up, actually 7 years after the Cochrane collaboration was set up, probably because we needed to wait until the Cochrane collaboration produced evidence, was because there were unexplained and unpopular variations in health outcomes within England and the rest of the UK. Importantly, the UK was falling behind the uptake of new technologies, and the affordability of new technologies meant that we had to make sure that we had a system to make sure that we were using the limited resources available in the NHS to the best possible means. And the idea that in order to move towards this, we needed an evidence-based approach. But particularly, as I just said, is that evidence alone will not help implementation, and therefore we need to produce guidance for professionals to help them think about the most effective actions that are available out there. Hence the reason why NICE was commissioned. So in April 2013, we became the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence. Mistake number one, I said we. I don't work there anymore, so I'm able to be a little bit more critical of NICE processes. But importantly, NICE as an organisation has had an increasingly expanded role because people believe in it. People believe that it's actually doing a good job. And evidence-based medicine and public health are increasingly important, and therefore it's survived. It's survived in the context of all these other changes that are going on in the NHS. What is our role? I've said it again, but it's not important because I believe in the work of the organisation. The role of NICE is to identify good clinical and public health and social care practice using the best available evidence, to help resolve uncertainty, and to reduce variation in the availability and quality of practice and care. And this is how we add values. But I've already said this, so I don't need to go through this slide again. But actually, importantly, just focusing on a couple of things. One is to provide access. Even though there might be drugs and treatments available, not everybody is getting access. And NICE guidance in itself needs to make sure that actually there is access for all, irrespective of your race, religion, or any other dimension of health inequalities. And importantly, within the context of NICE, we have to make sure that we can make use of the existing resources. So we rely very much on health economics as a means to do so. Mandatory or not, I get asked this question a lot. Not all NICE guidance is mandatory, i.e. not everybody has to do it if it becomes available. The only part of NICE that is mandatory is the work of the Health Technology Department. And they have to demonstrate, anybody, the NHS has to demonstrate within 3 months of a piece of NICE guidance on a health technology, a drug that is recommended for practice, they have to implement this. In public health, we're not so lucky. You know, guidance is maybe seen as a good thing to do, but you don't have to follow it. That said, if you think back to the idea of NICE working with the regulators, a lot of people use NICE guidance because it's a useful way of actually demonstrating they're making progress. And all organisations, as part of the health and social care system, have to demonstrate and monitor and evaluate what they do is effective. And I've already talked about this slide, so I'll move on. What do people think about NICE? When it was set up, the government was obviously supportive because they set it up, and the other advocacy groups were curious, academics were curious, and the media was even more curious. And obviously, within the context of the drug environment, the pharmaceutical industry was skeptical and sometimes hostile. And the public didn't really understand it. As we move in today, most people nationally, and I think it's true to say that a lot of people internationally, look at NICE as a quality organisation, and they respect the work that it does. The media remain curious, and some of the media are hostile and blissfully ignorant. Well, actually, most people know about NICE. Even if I go to parties and I tell them about the work that I did in NICE, people know what it is, even if they're not working in the health service. And I think that's an achievement in itself. Because one of the reasons why people follow NICE guidance is people believe in the product. They believe in the organisation because it acts in a truthful and transparent way and as an explicit process. And therefore, this is really one very important thing in terms of considering whether an evidence-based approach is helpful to making sure that professionals make effective and quality decisions. So this is just an example on a slide. We get a lot of the time, particularly in the drug health technology departments, you know, if NICE says no to a drug, then it's a very emotive business. And therefore, we get a lot of bad press from particularly a paper called the Daily Mail, who says that we should be scrapped. The other contention is that NICE is not independent, and this is a picture of Tony Blair, a previous Prime Minister, but he was the one who set it up. We call it an arm's length body. That means that we're independent from here to here. We're funded by the Department of Health, but we make independent decisions. Now, whether you can make your own judgment about the independence of guidance. Well, I'll give you one example. I was involved within the context of a piece of public health guidance on reducing harm from alcohol. One of the recommendations that we made, because there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that it's effective, is to introduce the idea of minimum price. That alcohol sold in supermarkets in particular shouldn't go below a particular price. And the government so far have failed to introduce that as an guidance too. But also really interesting is that a lot of people see NICE as an organisation that stops the provision of important drugs that can actually be implemented to cure or treat particular diseases. And actually 80% of the drugs that NICE looks at are implemented, and only a small proportion are not. So actually it's making the point that actually it's not an organisation that is trying to stop treatments or technologies that are available, but it is an organisation that's trying to ensure the quality of the provision and making sure that we use the best use of available resources. Just for those people, you can have this presentation made available to you afterwards, but now in 2013, NICE produces guidance on a whole range of different areas of the health and social care sector, and I've given you the link to the page on the NICE website where you can actually look for more information if you should wish to do so. And this describes the increase in the number of pieces of work that we're now producing. So we produced a lot of evidence-based material, but the question of implementation that I'm going to talk about in a little while is still an issue for NICE. I'll spend a little bit of time going through the principles of NICE guidance and how it's produced. I've already talked a lot about the need for a comprehensive evidence base, but NICE relies on expert input. Expert input where the evidence perhaps does not yet appear in the scientific world, and expert input in order to make sure that the evidence that is available is producing and summarizing the consensus of information around that topic. Importantly, and this is where NICE has a real strength, is that any committee that's set up to develop NICE guidance involves patients and carers or members of the community, those people who may be suffering from a particular condition or a disease, and they have equal say within how NICE guidance is produced based on the evidence that the committees are subjected to. The people who work for NICE, those people who are employed by NICE, do not produce the guidance. They are the secretariat to the committees. The NICE guidance is produced by independent advisory committees. People from all parts of the sector come together in order to actually make sure that there's a level of independence on the evidence that was being created in order to produce the guidance. We consult at different stages in the process to make sure that we're getting it right. And NICE guidance is subject to review. Every 3 years, a piece of NICE guidance has to be looked at again in order to make sure that the recommendations that have been made are still relevant and up to date with the evidence. And the reason why this set of principles is important, because NICE believes that you need an open and transparent process for how decisions have been made, particularly when the evidence doesn't tell you exactly what to do. I'm going to leave this slide, it's a bit complicated. This gives you a description of the particular process that NICE goes through in order to produce its guidance. So once the government, the Department of Health, decides what NICE will produce as guidance, and the NICE internal teams have to produce something called a scope, which really sets out the parameters of a work, what outcomes you're looking at, whether there are any inclusions or exclusions within the guidance, the questions that you're trying to answer, and importantly, whether there are any particular population groups that are important within the context of the guidance. The next phase is around the biggest phase of the work, which is around developing the evidence base. NICE uses universities to compile the evidence for them. It's not done internally, it's done externally to NICE. And then they construct the committees, those people from practice, from academia, from different parts of the health and social care sector, who have a responsibility to consider the evidence that's produced and think about the actions that will follow from that. We then set the guidance into a public forum on the web so that people can comment at all stages in the process. And then internally, NICE have this thing called the Guidance Executive Committee. And if you're, as an associate director, I was responsible for producing a bit of guidance. It's like a PhD viva. You have to go into this Guidance Executive Committee, and they will test you that you've actually followed the process in an appropriate manner. So it's very systematic in approach, and importantly, as I said earlier, the system and process is open and transparent. So one of the key messages I'd like to give you today is that process is as important or even more important than the evidence base upon which NICE guidance is produced. For those of you who find it difficult to sleep at night and want to find more details of how NICE does things, it's available in something called the Unified Manual. The Unified Manual details the common process that is used by all different departments within NICE that produce different types of guidance. But again, it's very useful in terms of getting a bit more clarity about the way in which the guidance is produced. Just to focus on going back to evidence-based decision-making, these are the questions that we ask of the evidence in the first instance. Is it effective? But also in public health, the things in red are the things that we ask also in public health. Is it effective? But how is it effective? And how does it work for different populations in different contexts? This is really important. Is it ineffective? Or should we be disinvesting in something? This is a difficult question because often the evidence will not allow you to make that decision. But sometimes the works of the committee might make the decision that they will not recommend things because there is this question over whether something is effective or not. Importantly, and against all our principles, we've got to test whether it's maybe recommendations that we make are harmful or dangerous. And again, importantly, we ask the question of cost effectiveness. So we ask particular subsets of questions around the evidence, and these are they, but what is the strength of evidence? Do we think there's a strength of evidence from a range of different studies in order to make recommendations? We ask about the size of effect, but important, we ask whether there's any evidence available that allow us to say something about health inequalities. The Public Health Centre in NICE, actually, that is central to what they do, making sure that we don't have a detrimental effect on any particular population group. But this is true for all aspects of NICE producing centres. The evidence problem. One of the problems or the challenges within the evidence base is that there's often, in many areas, a dearth of good outcome studies answering the question what works. There's a lot of evidence out there, but whether it's good evidence is another matter, and this is what NICE does. NICE actually quality assures the evidence that's being published in scientific research. But there's still fewer studies that answer the question what works, for whom, and under what circumstances. And we've learned a lot within public health about how to do this. So the important aspect of this slide is actually, if you just relied on the systematic reviews that were produced by the Cochrane collaboration, it wouldn't really allow you to make a set of recommendations about what to do. And that's why the NICE committees come into the fold, because they have the job of assimilating what we know and what other information we need in order to make effective decisions. This is some more examples of problems with the evidence, but I'm not going to focus on this because I want to get through some more slides around implementation. Show you this slide because people are very interested in the cost effectiveness, but we have a system whereby we use something called the quality adjusted life year, which allows us to make a judgment of whether the cost of doing something is outweighed by the benefits. And each intervention that we look at will be tested against this. And we have this diagram actually provides a diagrammatic representation of when we will actually make a decision to recommend something or not. So if something is deemed to be under £20,000 per quality adjusted life year, NICE will normally recommend it. If it goes above that, the decision around whether to recommend it will be a little bit more difficult, but they might still, up to about 30,000. Anything above £30,000 per quality adjusted life year will not be recommended for the NHS. The good news, and I'm a public health specialist, so I'll make a plug for public health. We've done a lot of studies around the cost effectiveness of public health interventions, and all public health interventions have come out as cheap. So for those clinicians in the room, always try and think a little bit about prevention. So in terms of, we have a process for developing recommendations. We need to guide the committees to make sure that they take a systematic approach to how they think about the actions that follow from the evidence. And these on this slide actually allow the committees to make those judgments. Is the evidence good enough to proceed in making recommendations? We've got a set of criteria that allows them to do them. A lot of the studies that we have available to us in England come from the US. So we have to make some extrapolations, or we have to make sure that the evidence is applicable to the UK context. And often, actually, a lot of people in other countries say, actually, well, maybe we can just implement the NICE guidance that's produced on the NICE website. Well, actually, I think given the process is as important as the evidence itself, actually, it's not really reasonable to do that, because any country that wishes to use NICE guidance needs to understand the relevance for their own country. And it may or may not be the case that it's relevant for either the Spanish context or any other country that is interested to use NICE guidance. That said, there is a duplication of effort in producing evidence. There's a lot of information on the NICE website that might be useful to people in the room as a starting point for the types of interventions that are effective worldwide. And then it might be that you have to have your own process for assessing the actions that will follow from that. So to summarize the evidence again never tells you exactly what to do. The evidence from scientific research sets out a set of scientific plausibilities. And what NICE committees have to do is make a threshold judgment of whether there's enough evidence in place in order to continue forward, in order to make recommendations. Groups involved in appraisal, this slide gives you some examples of the types of people involved. Remember that NICE guidance is not produced by the people who are employed by NICE, but a range of people from different walks of life in the health and social care sector, in order that we can be seen to be independent. I put this slide not for you to read but for those epidemiologists in the room who are involved in, who know about the work of Austin Bradford Hill, who talked about this issue of association and causation. What the NICE process tries to reflect, and the process of producing guidance from evidence, is to ensure that we're getting as near possible as causation as possible by using a set of criteria. And the criteria of Austin Bradford Hill are actually quite useful in thinking about whether we've got enough evidence to proceed to the next step. In terms of stakeholders, I said earlier, stakeholders have the possibility to comment on the scope, whether they think we've got it right for the right population groups. They can submit evidence that might not come from the scientific community, and they can actually raise questions about the evidence that is produced. And they can raise questions about the draft guidance that is produced. Basically, once the committee produces guidance, they produce a draft version that goes on the website for 6 weeks, and we have stakeholders who can actually make their comments that have to be considered by NICE before the final version of the NICE guidance is published. And importantly, particularly within the context of drugs, there is a right to appeal. If people think the final guidance that is produced by NICE is not correct or it's missed something, they can put in a right to appeal, and then we have another process for dealing with that. I said this earlier, but in England we have something called the Equalities Act of 2010, which makes sure that all public sector bodies have to take account of a range of dimensions of the population upon which they serve. And we have a process for testing NICE guidance to ensure that it's not detrimental to any of these population groups listed on this slide. And actually, I think that's one way that we can contribute to reducing health inequalities, to make sure that it doesn't have harmful effects. And finally, some slides around implementation. Some people think that if you produce NICE guidance, then a miracle will occur and everything will be okay. The outcomes framework that I depicted earlier will be achieved. But actually, that's not the case, as I'm sure you well know. And we need a science of implementation as well as a science of cost effectiveness and cost effectiveness. This is a really important aspect that's probably been neglected over the past 5 or 10 years, but is coming into the fore as an important thing to do. I've said it already, but evidence is essential but not sufficient basis for policy or practice action, and you need a whole range of different types of knowledge in order to get there. Clearly, NICE committees have a role in doing that because they can bring in different types of evidence, but also, importantly, there has to be a political will to implement NICE guidance. Now, there is a political will in the UK to implement the guidance that is for local professionals, but if we make recommendations to the government, which we don't do very readily now, around minimum price, for example, then the will may or may not. There's a whole range of barriers to implementation, and I'm not going to go through the slide because of time, but it's important for you to think about the types of things that need to be overcome or need to be sorted within the structural or financial restraints that people have in order to give professionals, individual professionals, the ability to do the best that they possibly can. If we don't sort the system out, then actually the evidence that is available to us that tells us what to do cannot be effective. Interesting, one other thing I like to focus on, for those of you who work in public health, we use a whole range of different behaviours of theory change. If we want to get people to stop smoking, there are a whole range of different theories that understand the way that people initiate their decision to change a behaviour and a set of processes that you need to go through in order to make sure that they can do the possibility themselves. Well, actually, this is the same. These sorts of theories can be helpful to getting professionals to change their behaviour, because the instinctive thing for a professional, if they've been doing something for a long time, why should they change their behaviour? What is it? Just because we produce NICE guidance is not necessarily going to allow them to suddenly change. And we need to invest in training and education in order to support professionals get to the right place. And these are a whole range of reasons why people don't change behavior, and if you're interested, then you can follow the reference through that I have. One of the other ways in which we can increase the implementation of NICE guidance is to produce something called a quality standard. NICE guidance produces a series of recommendations, and stemming from that, we can produce a quality standard which is a specific indicator that the regulators can use as a way of measuring whether implemented. And over the last 5 years, NICE has produced a whole range of quality standards that are linked to the evidence and the guidance that it's produced, which is available on the website. Incentivizing change, particularly in primary care, we have something called the Quality and Outcomes Framework that actually allows GPs to be paid if they implement certain bits of the guidance that we produce. But there is a whole process by which we go for in order to actually understand that we're actually incentivizing the right things. But it's another mechanism to increase the use of implementation. Costing tools. If you tell people that they're actually going to be able to save money from implementing NICE guidance, then they're more likely to do it. And NICE produces a whole range of costing tools. The tools that actually allows them to understand how much it will cost to implement NICE guidance given their local population. And these have proved to be very popular. So if you want to know more about how NICE implements its guidance, this is the link to their webpage. But the important message that I want to give you today is that, you know, evidence alone is not going to change things, and if you don't invest in the things that are required at an implementation level, then actually you're more unlikely to achieve success and achieve the outcomes that are set out in your outcomes framework. Evidence-based practice, where we are now, it's the system that actually is the biggest barrier to change. And you need to think about the things within the system that are which are actually getting the evidence stuck that doesn't allow it to actually go anywhere. Most recently, someone called Trish Greenhouse, you might know, published a paper in 2014, thinks that the evidence-based movement is in crisis. Because whilst there have been some successes, the variation in implementation still exists, and if we don't take care of that, then all the money and investment that's been spent on getting the evidence there will be a waste of time. So we need to rethink. And the way that we're thinking about that in public health, because I'm going to give a plug for public health right at the end of my presentation, is by thinking about the system as a whole. And actually, whether it's the professionals or the people that we're trying to serve, we need to think about the social context of people's lives. And interestingly, the manual that was used up until 2015 for public health actually dealt with some of those issues. What types of evidence do we need that will help us change the system? This is really important for implementation issues. And something that is actually coming on stream, and one of the reasons why I work so closely with Mariana, is the idea of a health assets approach to health and development. These are a couple of publications that we've produced in recent years. But the idea is that actually most of policy in practice is based on what we call a deficit model. Deficit models focus on identifying problems and needs of populations requiring professional services, resulting in high levels of dependence on hospital and welfare services. The asset model tends to accentuate positive ability, capability, and capacity. And that can be thought about at two levels. The positive ability of local communities, of individuals, the way that doctors talk to their patients, giving them a voice. The idea of participation is really important. And then we can work out how we can actually work on a challenge together. And therefore, the idea of participation in health is really important, as encompassed in the asset-based approach. We use theories, again, within this approach, and one of the theories we use is something called salutogenesis, because a lot of the health and social care service focus on, importantly, a lot of the time, on actually preventing illness and disease. But how can we create health? How can we create an environment that allows people to grow and development? The idea of salutogenesis helps to ask the right questions, and we might need to draw on a whole range of different evidence in order to get there. It doesn't discount the need to actually deal with problems as they arise, but actually from a contextual point of view and getting the system right, and it's something to think about. There is evidence to suggest that the more that you involve local people, individuals or communities in the health development process, the more likely your programs and initiatives are able to be effective. And this is some work that's been done by Jenny Pope in 2010, which actually demonstrated that you can actually have increased effectiveness if people have been involved in that process. So participation is really fundamental to the use of implementing evidence and guidance. I've already said this, but I'm going to give it another plug. Public health is cheap. We did a study that demonstrated that you could actually save money, or you could get money back if you invested in public health interventions. So don't forget about prevention. It has to be done in parallel, in contrast to the important work that is done in the health and social care services. And I'll stop there.
Por el tiempo. ¿Nadie me guiña? ¿Tenemos tiempo? ¿Cuánto? ¿10 minutos? 5. Bueno, pues abrimos un turno de preguntas, de opiniones, palabras, sugerencias, si es que alguien quiere comentar algo en el sentido de la conferencia de Anthony. Por ahí tenemos pedida la palabra Sergio Minué y Pepe Espósito. Sergio.
Hola, buenos días. Buenos días. No sé si me puedes escuchar. ¿Se escucha ahora? Hola, buenos días. En primer lugar, quería felicitar a Anthony por una conferencia tan interesante. Además, yo creo que de una iniciativa como es el NICE, que es referencia para gran parte de los países del mundo, incluido el nuestro, aunque de una manera tangencial. Mi pregunta era en relación con lo que ha comentado en cuanto a un aspecto muy concreto de las iniciativas que se han desarrollado en Reino Unido en esta última década y que son los Quality Outcome Framework. No sé si se escucha. Sí. La pregunta era en relación con los Quality Outcome Framework. En el año pasado en New England, Martin Rowland, el profesor que yo creo que lleva más tiempo investigando sobre lo que son los sistemas de incentivación, específicamente en Reino Unido y sobre todo los ligados al Quality Outcome Framework, hablaba de que aunque los efectos que pueden tener los sistemas de incentivación ligados al desempeño, el Pay for Performance, puede ser efectivos a corto plazo, a largo plazo deberían complementarse con otro tipo de iniciativas, fundamentalmente por dos razones. La primera tiene que ver con que tienen o pueden tener los sistemas de incentivación efectos perversos, es decir, aquello por lo que no me pagas no lo hago, en primer lugar, y en segundo lugar porque no todo es medible. Y yo creo que eso es muy importante cuando estamos hablando de sistemas de indicadores que gran parte de la práctica clínica no se puede medir. En ese sentido, por ejemplo, yo creo que una de las deficiencias que tienen ese tipo de modelos es que en España específicamente, si se deja de incentivar algunas prácticas, y eso ha pasado, por ejemplo, en atención primaria ligado a la atención al domicilio, se dejan de hacer o no se hacen de la manera que deberían hacerse. Quería preguntarle si en NICE se está trabajando algún otro tipo de medidas complementarias a lo que son simplemente sistemas basados en evidencia científica ligada a la medición. Muchas gracias.
Nice if you, well, first of all, I have to say that I agree with you because the whole process of the quality outcomes framework, it could be dangerous for all the reasons you expressed. Although there is an evidence base to suggest that actually it improves implementation, but also there are, within the context of public health guidance, incentives for changing behaviour amongst the local population is also is also deemed to be an effective means of intervening. But actually, one of the key questions is it a moral thing to do? NICE is bound by a set of moral principles, and its quality outcomes framework is not something that NICE have instigated. It's more general as the health and social care system. So in answer to your question, first of all, NICE has a whole range of different implementation tools and techniques it uses to work with local providers to encourage them to use, to implement the guidance. So incentives is only one thing. But one of the important things messages I was trying to make at the end was the idea of empowering professionals to do the best that they can possibly can, and making sure that we don't produce too much work for professionals, so that they actually feel as though, well, I'm going to make decisions, and we have a whole systems approach to making sure that we achieve the outcomes that we really want to do. But important to that is actually reducing the demand for for services, because there's a lot of demand that could be reduced if we empower populations, communities, local individuals. And therefore, it's a longer-term endeavour. And this is the problem, is that incentives is seen to be a quick fix. You know, do it, and there are key indicators we can measure it. But if we don't move to a sort of more coherent, holistic approach to thinking about how we produce and deliver healthcare and how we improve the health of the population as a whole over the long time, by dealing with the system, by making sure that we, when we work with professionals, we're working with them in a way that actually respects the time available and resources that they have. So it's a long way of saying that actually incentives is actually just one way of doing it. There are risks, and there's a whole range of other things that we can do, but it's not perfect. But more emphasis on the system to get the system right will maybe incentivize without money the primary healthcare system to do the right thing. But this takes time, and we don't necessarily have it right in the UK. People think because NICE is this organisation, it's fixed it. There's lots of challenges within the UK, particularly around implementation. But I have a hesitation over the quality and outcomes framework that actually needs to be thought about in the longer term.
Sí, yo también quiero felicitar al profesor porque nos ha dado una conferencia nos ha recordado la importancia de la revisión sistematizada, transparente e independiente, ¿no?, para que sistemas como este puedan ser de utilidad. Sin embargo, a mí me interesa, yo soy oncólogo y me interesa un poco circunscribirme a la relación de la producción de NICE con el entorno profesional. En la diapositiva de 2015 ponía también a los profesionales como supporters de las decisiones de NICE. Sin embargo, todos leemos en el BMJ o en cualquier revista la constante pelea, lucha que hay de sectores profesionales, concretamente oncólogos, y las recomendaciones de NICE. No sé cómo se hace ese debate, no sé cómo es solo autoridad o hay alguna otra manera de interlocución. Sí, decía que leemos constantemente también en revistas como el BMJ que los profesionales, cuando reaccionan en contra de determinadas recomendaciones que ha hecho NICE, por ejemplo, para la no introducción de un determinado fármaco. Eso está pasando ahora con frecuencia, y la pregunta era que cómo es la relación entre NICE y este grupo de profesionales para que finalmente el proceso vaya adelante.
So, in part, and the slide that I put on that said actually most people think that NICE is a good thing. I think it's true in general, but I always compared two reactions that I had when I went to see the doctor for myself. There was a consultant working in the hospital and another one, my GP. When I said I work for NICE, he said, "Oh, that's a good thing. You really like it." And then my consultant at the hospital, when I said I work for NICE, he just went, "Oh, God." And so NICE can be perceived as causing more work, or that actually what NICE is sometimes doing is actually raising questions about what professionals have done before. So one of the things that NICE does, well, there are two things that NICE do. One, the transparent and open process gives NICE the credibility that they've actually they've based it on the right evidence, and they've had sufficient discussion within their committees and brought different types of people in to make sure that the final decision that's made is the right thing to do. But again, there's no definitive outcome, and not everybody will be happy. Sometimes if there is a particular strength of argument, then NICE have the possibility to actually bring and add to the process specific discussions with a particular group of professionals who are particularly not happy with the guidance. And one example I've got in public health is the guidance I worked on around the benefits and risks of sun exposure. Dermatologists think you should never go in the sun at all, and then there's those people who are resistant to the idea of nanny state that actually said we should be getting out and enjoying the sun in order to have the benefits of it. And there was such controversy about the right thing to do that we introduced a mechanism whereby we had an additional meeting that brought the professionals together. So that's something that we can do. But at the end of the day, I think the answer to your question is NICE relies on its process to make sure that it gets it right. It's got a right of appeal, and people have an opportunity to be involved in the process, a whole range of different professionals, as the NICE guidance is developed. But at the end of the day, there might still be people who don't agree with what we've said.
¿Alguna cuestión más? ¿No? Muchas gracias. Continuamos. Gracias.